When I saw the first ghost of white water run crosswise to our wake at Tassafaronga, he would later say that Guadalcanal stopped being an island and became a knife. Fire controlman 3rd Class Ellis Ward stood in the after radar plot under the armored hood of USS Minneapolis heavy cruiser CA-36 flagship of Task Force 67 and watched the SG sweep paint small moving commas to the west of Lunga Point. The date was the night of November 30th, 1942. The place was Ironbottom Sound north of Guadalcanal and west of Savo Island. The order in his ear was steady. Rear Admiral Carleton H Wright had the line moving east by southeast at 20 knots. Van destroyers were trawling the dark for the Tokyo Express. The track they hunted ran from Rabaul and Shortland down the slot and into Tassafaronga. The Japanese destroyers carried drums of rice and fuel for the 17th Army on Guadalcanal under General Hyakutake. They carried also Type 93 long lance torpedoes that made night water boil. He could name the order of battle the way a mechanic names the parts in a chest. Task Force 67.
Rear Admiral Carleton H Wright.
Heavy cruisers USS Minneapolis and USS New Orleans, both New Orleans class with 8-inch 55 caliber guns in triple turrets. USS Pensacola and USS Northampton, both with 8-inch batteries on tall stock masts. Destroyers in the van. USS Fletcher, USS Drayton, USS Maury, USS Perkins. Destroyers in trail. USS Lamson, USS Lardner. The cruiser screen walked behind the van destroyers. SG surface search radar was new magic on Minneapolis and on Fletcher. SC air search was the older eye overhead. FC and Mk3 fire control radar tickled the directors with course range. The formation was line ahead. The track carried them about 9 miles north of Lunga Point. Ahead and to the west lay Tassafaronga and Cape Esperance and the channel where the Japanese liked to thread night. He had learned the Japanese names from briefings that felt like prayers. Reizo Tanaka in Destroyer Naganami leading Destroyer Squadron 30. The transport group tonight would be destroyers Kajiro Oyashio, Kuroshio, Makinami, Suzuki's Kawakazi. The screen ship Grim on point was Takanami. Each carried steel drums ready to be kicked overboard with lines so they could be dragged to shore near Tassafaronga. Each carried Type 93 oxygen-fueled torpedoes, 610mm monsters with warheads over 400 kilograms and ranges that broke common sense. 20 knots would not outrun them. A turn at the wrong time would not outrun them. The long lance did not care what a man believed about range and speed. It wrote a new arithmetic at Tassafaronga. The sky over Ironbottom Sound wore a low cap of cloud. The trades rolled at 10 knots. The sea was black oil with a little wind-picked lace on top. On the chart table, the bearing of Savo Island was a blunt wedge south by southwest. Lunga Point and Henderson Field on Guadalcanal were to starboard at 5 to 8 miles. The glow of campfires and field lights was behind the ridge. The lights were faint, and then they were gone, and then they were faint. Fletcher on the van had the better SG set. Minneapolis had 1-2. On the SG, Ellis Ward watched the little fat lines thicken. The range to first contact was about 20,000 yards, then 18, then 16. The plot wrote 3 groups. One was the screen ship ahead. One was a second cluster astern of that. One was a wider smear farther west, which meant the follow on destroyers with drums and cargo. At 23:06, the order came from flag.
Commence action.
Open fire by radar at the leading target. Minneapolis elevated turret 1 and 2 in a drill that felt like breathing. The SG fed range updates to fire control. The first salvo from 8-inch rifles left with that deep arching crack that hits the ribs. New Orleans to port matched her shot. Then Pensacola, then Northampton. Van destroyers were ordered to fire spreads of Mark 15 torpedoes to blanket the lead of the enemy group. The lead destroyer did not loose at first. Reports later said an order misunderstanding or a fear of blue on blue under dark water. The cruisers had the first punches. The first targets in the V-notch were Takanami the screen and then Tanaka back in Naganami. The splashes walked across the lead and found the skin. Takanami took 8-inch hits within a minute and began to burn. Her AA mounts popped and then were quiet. The dark beyond her did not change shape. That dark was Destroyer Squadron 30. Ellis felt the ship sway into the rhythm of a gunnery turn. The 8-inch 55s cycled, breeches hammered and smoked. The director drummed bearing changes into the gunnery tower. The FC radar was Stone Age and new at once. Mk3 ranges bounced with C return and then settled. The rung voice in his headphones gave a new range. 13,500 yards. Deflection right 1-2.
Salvo.
The impact glows on Takanami made a low fire on the water. He heard cheers too low for words. He did his job and did not cheer because the SG sweep on the west had thickened. A black school of fish moved against their beam and every long-trained nerve wrote the word torpedoes even before he saw the whitening on the surface where a few tails cut air. Task Force 67 still marched in line ahead. Minneapolis at the head of the heavy cruisers. New Orleans in trace. Pensacola behind. Northampton last. The van destroyers were off to port after their first left turn under the opening order. They were not in position when the long lances came. The Japanese destroyers were in 3 or more groups astern of Takanami. Naganami and Kajiro and Oyashio and Kuroshio and the rest launched spread after spread on bearing at ranges Americans still thought impossible. Tanaka held his fire until his bearing opened. Then he fired all at once. He was a torpedo admiral by habit and by nature. The white was faint. The sea carried just enough phosphorus to show the faint Y lines. The arcs the fish made were not friendly. Ellis watched the SG and could not see a torpedo on SG. He saw only the enemy hulls sliding back and then he saw the first near-miss spout and then he felt the hit. Minneapolis took 2 torpedoes on the port bow within seconds. One struck below turret 1 abreast the aviation gasoline system. One struck below the forward magazines. The bow lifted and tore. The sea came in with a violence that made decks heave. The 8-inch rifle stopped to breathe and could not breathe. Ellis grabbed the lip of the plot hood and his pencil skated off the board. The voice from Damage Control Central came in short barks. Flooding forward. Port list. Counterflood starboard. Fires forward. Magazines being flooded. The lights flickered and then returned. Star shell popped somewhere up the line. The air stank of wet cordite and fuel and paint scattered like dust. Men forward went white, black, red and were gone in the same half-second. New Orleans was right astern. She did not have time to clear the wrecked bow of Minneapolis. She began to turn left to avoid and still to hold line. When the long lances arrived, she caught one under turret 1. The blast took her bow off clean. 100 feet of New Orleans from the first turret forward sheared away and went under the stab of the next wave. She kept steerage way with engines. She burned and lived and fought every foot to stay head to wind. Pensacola behind saw the violence and turned out to starboard to clear. The turn exposed her to the killing corner. A torpedo struck her starboard side abreast the mainmast. Fuel oil poured like dark rain through gaps. Fire rose in a trellis from the boat deck aft to the sky. Northampton did what captains do in a crisis. He turned the other way a little too late. 2 torpedoes caught her port side aft and the ship took a mortal list. Van destroyers found their torpedoes then and loosed into the dark. Fletcher Drayton Maury Perkins put out spreads of Mark 15 in the general bearing of the burning Takanami and the dim Naganami and Kajiro beyond. The angles were bad now. The timing was off because the line was broken and the enemy had already turned away behind the smoke of burning Takanami and their own exhaust. 1 American torpedo ran hot circling. 1 went inert. Some ran wrong depth. Some exploded short. Some made white scars that found only water. Fletcher opened with 5-inch stars and made a field of white over Naganami for a minute. The Japanese threw salvo after salvo of long lances in reply and then used smoke and speed to break contact. Ellis tried to keep a picture of iron and water in his head. The SG still found dots. The nearest dot was the loss of the bow. The sea lay up there now, not down there. The bow gun platform was gone. The forward crew were gone or under. The aviation gasoline explosion had perforated bulkheads like hands through paper. The captain of Minneapolis rang 3 bells to stop and brace, and the ship tried to stop in an ocean that did not care. She steadied. The list was 5 degrees to port, and then 7, and then 9, and then back down to 5. Damage control counterflooded starboard wing tanks. Pumps whined and held. The engine rooms were intact and the shaft still turned. The 8-inch aft turrets could still face aft in theory. The forward turret rooms were now C. New Orleans astern had less of a ship and yet more of a spirit. She got her fires under some kind of human. She kept a slow circle under Henderson Field. Pensacola turned under a fall of fire that made every seam glow, and still her men ran hoses and threw wet canvas and held. Northampton began to settle by the stern with the slow, proud ruin of a ship that knows she has hours. Her captain ordered starboard turns to keep towards shoal water near Tulagi, but the sea had a say. Destroyers came down the line into this maze. Lardner and Lamson and trail through smoke and then hauled men and then through more smoke. Fletcher turned back and tried to lay smoke between burning cruisers and the track where any chasing torpedoes might choose to live. Maury and Perkins threaded the gap. The air smelled like every ship that had died in Ironbottom Sound since Savo. In the moment the line broke, Ellis felt a second task arrive like a second heartbeat. It was to stay with the enemy plot anyway. He kept the SG range rings updated to the east and west. He kept the small green commas that were enemy destroyers in a corner of his mind that was not on fire. Takanami fell away to the south in a slow smear. She burned from end to end, and then her fire went black, and then she was a dot, and then the dot was gone. The other 6 or 7 Japanese destroyers had done what the Tokyo Express always did at Guadalcanal. They completed their run across the face of Tassafaronga. They jettisoned drums and ran trails lines and let men ashore pull the cargo in. They made smoke. They turned west. They wrote with Type 93 torpedoes on just the right bearing when the American line was still straight, and then they went away. He thought in numbers because numbers were the only food his mind could eat. Range for radar opens at 23,000 for the SG on a good night. Bearing rate 3 degrees per minute for that target in the western cluster. Speed 15 knots for the transport group before jettison of drums. Speed 34 knots for Kajiro when she ran. Spread settings for a long lance in a curved approach. Angle on the bow 50 starboard. He cleared the parallels on the vertical plot board with a sleeve and breathed and put them back and breathed again. The room got thicker and thinner as the ventilation fought the smoke that found any hole. On deck in the forward part of the ship, men had their hands on hot steel and did not let go. The forward magazines flooded. The scuttles were dogged. Casualties were counted and counted again because hands have to count or they shake. The men in the aft directors laid aft 8-inch in case a target showed. The 5-inch 25 mounts kept scanning and then went quiet. The 4 torpedo tubes on Minneapolis were silent. No man had time to argue that we should have launched early. The debate would wait until a day when the sea was not pushing fire through broken seams. A mile off he could see the farther round warmth of Guadalcanal. Henderson Field quietly ran its own war. Long runways and pierced steel planking. Cactus Air Force had flown that day and would fly again at light. The dark fell now and then rose and fell with star shells. Savo Island to port was a black tooth. The water there had been weighted since August. Names lay under it. USS Quincy, USS Astoria, USS Vincennes, HMAS Canberra. The Battle of Savo Island had given the name Ironbottom Sound to maps and prayers. Cape Esperance had given back a little pride in October when U.S. surface ships under Norman Scott had burned Furitaka and Fubuki. The naval battle of Guadalcanal had been fought mid-month with Washington and South Dakota and Japanese battleships Hai and Kirishima turning the night into an anvil. Now the night was writing another line. Tassafaronga. He heard the numbers of the damage assessment come in through the phones. Minneapolis. 2 torpedoes forward. Bow gone back to frame 30. Flooding contained. List reduced by counterflood. Steering steady. New Orleans. Bow gone back to frame 39. Steering by engines. Pensacola. 1 torpedo starboard side. Aviation gasoline fire. Turrets 2 and 3 oiled with flame and then saved. Northampton. 2 torpedoes port aft. List increasing. Prepare to abandon. Lardner and Lamson moved down to take Northampton men. Boats were in the water. Lines were under strain that men could feel in their teeth. It is an odd thing how much weight a line will lift when a man refuses to let it go. He thought of the men on the other side and he hoped they were tired. Reizo Tanaka in Naganami had done this run many times. He had taken shells from gunners who wanted to write a different story. He had slipped through smoke behind Savo when Cape Esperance was a lesson and nights after. He had trained men to throw drums to the sea and to count seconds with their lips so that lines would pay out and not foul. He had trained torpedo crews to set bearings by instinct and to count knots by the way a knight looks off a bow. He had led Kajiro Oyashio Kuroshio Suzuki's Kawakaze Makinami in turns so neat they would be studied for nothing more than their shape if war had not been the subject. He sent one message on TBS to his group and Ellis knew what it said without knowing Japanese. Said it is time. It said run. The field at Henderson was quiet and then not. The water would be full of work at dawn. At 0100 Northampton went down. She went down slow. She went down with destroyers alongside to move men and with boats around her to grab the last men who jumped. She went down with the 7th Division standing by to salute something they did not want to salute. She had figures on her decks and then figures on her rails and then she had her bow high and then she did not. She added her iron to Ironbottom Sound and her men to the lists in leather covers and in heads that would never tell the number to more than one person. Ellis wrote words down because if he did not write he would shake. Task Force 67. Tassafaronga Guadalcanal. Ironbottom Sound. Savo Island.
Rear Admiral Carleton H Wright.
Destroyer Squadron 30. Reizo Tanaka. Naganami. Takanami. Kajiro. Oyashio. Kuroshio. Suzuki's. Kawakaze. Makinami. USS Minneapolis. USS New Orleans. USS Pensacola. USS Northampton. USS Fletcher. USS Drayton. USS Maury. USS Perkins. USS Lamson. USS Lardner.
Type 93 Long Lance.
Mark 15 Torpedo. SG Radar. SC Radar. Mk3 Fire Control Radar. He read the list back under his breath and found that it sounded like a prayer in a language he did not need to translate to understand. He had time then to consider the quiet anger he felt. It was not at men. It was at ideas. The idea that radar alone could stop a torpedo doctrine that had been trained into men for 15 years. The idea that 8-inch shells end a fight faster than fish do. The idea that van destroyers would always loose first. In the debrief he would hear commanders speak about fire discipline and about torpedo doctrine and about the need for early launch at likely bearing. He would not say much in that room because his job was to listen. He would jot down on a card 3 points. Use SG to solve for a bearing line for fish first and gun second. Load van destroyers for a probable bearing and do not wait for a golden picture. Keep line ahead loose enough to make a quick turn in case the white shows. He would keep the card. He would read it again months later and adjust 2 words and be no happier. In the morning the water off Lunga Point was full of work. Minneapolis lay at anchor with a bow made of temporary structure and hose and will. New Orleans faced east with her cut-off front like a man with his teeth knocked out and a grin still on his face. Pensacola lay with smoke ghosts all over her aft star. Destroyers moved with cargo nets and men. Tugs moved with odd ends. Marines stood on the beach with cigarettes and stared and did not say much. The word Tassafaronga went up and down the line with heads bowed. The phrase long lance left every mouth like a coin a man did not want to spend. The phrase Tokyo Express was said with more respect than before. The phrase Task Force 67 was said with more weight. He walked out onto the weather deck and breathed a daylight air that took away some of the last night. He had work. He had inspections to make. He had a radar set to clean and calm. He had 100 duty cycles to run. He also had a story he would have to tell someone one day in a place with no map. He began to tell it to himself now. He said the names. He laid them out like tools. He made the lines on a fresh chart. Savo west. Tassafaronga northwest. Lunga to the south. Our track east by southeast. Their track east then south then west. The place of first salvo at 2306. The place of first hit on Minneapolis at 2312. The place where New Orleans lost her bow. The place where Pensacola was hit. The place where Northampton sank. He wrote the places down without judgment. A man can draw his shame and his pride on the same paper. He stood there for a long time and then he went below to clean the SG scope and cheer its phosphor back to life. He knew now that it was a candle that sees wind. It is not a prophecy. It is a helper. He knew that the Japanese had taught him a thing against his will. They had taught him that torpedoes at 40 knots and more with ranges of 10 or 12 miles change math in a way that men like him have to learn in fog. He did not thank them. He did not curse them. He wrote it down. He found later the weight of detail would not leave him. He could tell you the diameter of the Type 93 in millimeters and the weight of its warhead in kilograms. He could tell you the weight of an 8-inch AP shell in pounds and the range table for a 10-degree elevation. He could tell you the bearings that matter off Lunga Point on a night with clouds at 3,000 feet. He could tell you the rotation speed of an SG antenna. He could tell you the shift that happens when a ship loses a bow and must be sailed back to Espiritu Santo with an apron of logs and bar steel. He could tell you how long it takes to patch Pensacola when aviation gasoline has burned through decks and girders and left men under paint. He could tell you a lot of things, and none of them were stories. The story of Tassafaronga did not want adjectives. It wanted names, places, bearings, times, and the small human acts that stand up to long steel. He did not begrudge Tanaka his skill. He wrote the name Reizo Tanaka in a small book, and under it wrote the shape of a man who understands night water and who trains his men to act on the edge of rules. He wrote under that Destroyer Squadron 30, Naganami, Kajiro, Oyashio, Kuroshio, Makinami, Suzukaze, Kawakazi. He added Takanami and then crossed it out because the sea had crossed it out and because the men on Takanami deserved not to be treated as a line on a list. He added Task Force 67 and under it the 4 cruisers and the 6 destroyers. He added Rear Admiral Carleton H Wright and next to it he wrote the word radar with a small frowning mark because he did not know how else to show the feeling of a tool used well and late at once. He dreamed once of the white lines again. He saw the white run under the bow and he knew there was a thing he could do and he could not do it because the thing was already done. He woke and lay still and told himself a new truth. The thing to do next time is to make the line first. He told the room he was in. Pitch the van to bear in at the first good SG plot. Loosen the line. Keep cruisers ready to comb fish with a turn. Do not gloat at a burning picket when the rest of the pack is quiet. He said it to the bulkhead and the bulkhead said nothing back and he liked the bulkhead for that because arguments should be put away before breakfast. When he spoke the story out loud years later in a hall, he started with the title that his chest had carried since the night. When I saw the first ghost of Whitewater run crosswise to our wake at Tassafaronga, I knew Long Lance torpedoes had found our line and that Task Force 67 would pay for the lesson in steel at Guadalcanal. Then he said the names one by one. USS Minneapolis, USS New Orleans, USS Pensacola, USS Northampton, USS Fletcher, USS Drayton, USS Maury, USS Perkins, USS Lamson, USS Lardner.
Rear Admiral Carleton H Wright.
Task Force 67. Takanami, Naganami, Kajiro, Oyashio, Kuroshio, Suzukaze, Kawakazi, Makinami, Reizo Tanaka, Tassafaronga, Guadalcanal, Ironbottom Sound, Savo Island.
Type 93 Long Lance.
Mark 15 Torpedo, SG Radar, SC Radar, Mk3 Fire Control Radar. He set them in the air like a flotilla and then he let the air go still. He did not add a moral. The water at Tassafaronga had already supplied one for anyone who wanted it.